All right, I think this is a good place for us to get started. Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers here in Houston, Texas with LaRouche Pack, and I'm back again with my friend Michael and Michael Steger, who will be leading our discussion here tonight. And I just want to make sure before we turn it over to Michael, just to give people a couple of highlights on what LaRouche Pack has been up to in actually leading the charge of the growing movement that is being built around the America First, around the MAGA movement, but more importantly, the question of what is going to be required for you, everyone listening to this call, to actually be prepared to take leadership. Because we know that there is not leadership coming from the Biden collective. As a matter of fact, as our discussion tonight here is going to take up the Biden breakdown from many different fronts. The breakdown is targeting our republic, the sovereignty of our nation. It's being done by the atrocious policies that are coming out of this administration. And what is absolutely required is that the American citizenry understand what their responsibilities are to ensure a total victory in the 2022 election, and what that means in terms of an economic transformation. And I know that people say, okay, LaRouche Pack has been leading the charge around abolishing the Fed, transforming, replacing the Fed with a third national bank. And this is not just a nice idea. It is absolutely indispensable and mandatory that this program be adopted by anyone who qualifies themselves to lead this country, to run for office, and who is going to be put forward as a viable candidate for the 2022 election as we pave the way for taking back the White House in 2024 with President Donald Trump and the policies for making America great again. So we know that with Biden's complete collapse and decline in his approval rating, rapidly going down the tubes, he can't do anything but go after the American people who are actually taking responsibility by, talking about calling people the ultra MAGA people, or referring to Trump as the great MAGA king. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you, a couple of my colleagues and I, the team from LaRouche Pack here, we went to an event on this past weekend with President Donald Trump speaking there, along with a number of others. People like Dinesh D'Souza were there, Don Trump Jr., and a number of other people. And as a matter of fact, I'll just say that Donald Trump Jr. said, well, if President Trump if my father is the great MAGA king, then I must be the great MAGA prince. But in all seriousness, though, although you have a number of people, as we're going to be discussing, obviously people are rightly upset about what's happening to our country. We see it every day. The borders are a disaster. Southern borders, we're spending $40 billion to send to aid to Ukraine when we can't take care of our own people here. We can't even feed our babies because there's no food on the shelves. So we can talk about all of these things, which are very much known and felt by the American people. People on this call, people watching this discussion are feeling it or seeing it. The question is, how do we fight back? And we're going to give you, again, the solutions to what's needed to transform the productive economy again, to make sure that we have the materials, the resources to rebuild our nation. And so with that, one thing I want to just point out before I turn it over to Michael here is what we are doing, the latest developments from LaRouche Pack. We have two important statements I want to point out from the website here. They are, first of all, at the top of our website, you have the latest statement by Barbara Boyd, which is very important because this, as a number of people are referencing what's happening to the direct murder, menticide being put forth by the increased drug overdoses devastating our nation by the drugs being funneled in and flooded in across the southern border, that this has to be stopped. And Barbara Boyd wrote an article, "Before Our Young Are Wiped Out Completely, It's Time for an Actual War on Drugs." And in that article, she identifies the fact that the recent Center for Disease Control announced approximately 107,000 or more Americans died from overdose in 2021. And that was a 15% increase from 2020. But the importance of this article, and I'm sure it'll be touched upon a little bit more, is not just the fact that the Biden administration is making it their number one priority to continue this insane menticide and destruction of our youth, of our population, by just saying, well, we're not really going to do anything about the drugs except for making so-called safe havens, passing out crack pipes, passing out needles, passing out drug strips to test, where people are. And this is completely insane. But this is what the oligarchy and controllers of Biden, Obama or Biden want. And this is what we have to put a stop to save our nation, to save our youth. Read this article and get it out far and wide, because the solution is our economic solution, but it's deeper. It's a cultural solution that we have to transform the culture that is creating this devastating breakdown. And secondly, we put a video compilation together, about 30 minutes. I encourage you, get this out on your social media everywhere, of Robert Ingram, on how to turn the Federal Reserve into a national bank. And this is very important. It answers a lot of questions that are coming up about the role of the Federal Reserve as a private bank, and how the national bank would actually work. And so I would encourage people to look at this in terms of the areas of production and physical economic development that is required, as was stated by our first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, in defining the role of a national bank. So those two things I want to point out to you. And again, if you have not already gone to our top bar here for abolishing the Federal Reserve, to get the resources you need and to get as many people as organizations, candidates, so forth, to sign on to our endorsement statement, I definitely encourage you to do that and to have the material and resources you needed. So again, those who will be listening to this on YouTube afterwards, I encourage everyone who's not signed up to get alerts for our Monday discussions, that you do so, that you subscribe, that you contribute to LaRouche PAC, and help us to continue to put this platform forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael here.
Thanks, Keisha. All right. So welcome, everyone. Great to have you back with us. I mean, this situation only grows more intense. So I want to address it from a certain standpoint, get at this national banking credit system from perhaps a deeper standpoint, because we've had a number of discussions about this. And for context, for those of you that are new, what we're proposing and the way LaRouche PAC operates is to recognize that, especially at this juncture, where you have a systemic breakdown, you've got these elites, these globalists, these so-called experts have become, their system has become so rigid, so inflexible, so incapable of doing anything positive to make any compromises with the basic interests of the population, that there's now a kind of a breakdown unfolding. In previous periods, there would be some levels of compromise. That's partly a psychological and intellectual deterioration of this entire class, the so-called credentialed class. What we intend to have is to wipe out, to drain the swamp of all of these factions or of these groupings. And the main way to do that is to take away its enforcement. Its enforcement is the intelligence agencies, the FBI operations, the intimidations and entrapments that we see from the FBI going back really decades. I mean, that was the FBI's MO when it was set up by Napoleon and run by a guy named Napoleon, believe it or not, back in 1906. So, but you've got to move that out because it's an enforcement, it's an intimidation. For what? What's it enforcing? It's enforcing an oligarchical financial system. It's enforcing that the control of resources, of investment, of credit, of currency, of banking, of trade is controlled by a small set of people at the top. And from that center of the top, or that financial program, stems a cultural agenda which, Thomas Malthus put well: huddle them together, keep them stupid, keep them entertained, basically in Roman imperial fashion, blood and games, blood and gore, the famous hedge fund of David Blood and Al Gore, blood and gore, and control the population, dumb them down. And you see it today from the so-called kind of liberal fascists of Gates and Klaus Schwab and others that we discussed last week. So that's what they're enforcing, and that's what keeps the swamp at bay. That's what creates figures like McCarthy or McConnell, is this broader swamp environment. We want to expose how McConnell, McCarthy come out of this deeper swamp. But what we have to recognize, we have to build an army that can mobilize to replace their failed system. And that's both a cultural question and it's an economic one. We've got a political system that works. We have a constitutional system. It's not enforced, but who enforces it? Is it the FBI's job to enforce that? No. It's the citizens. And what we've been lacking these many decades has been your engagement, the broader population's engagement. That's what has become a turning point today. So when they come up with 6 months of poll-tested language on ultra MAGA, what you quickly find out is that this is just like the deplorables from Hillary Clinton, that these are embraced, or the let's go Brandon, a reference to the FJB, get rid of Biden. But there's a kind of humor and playfulness from an army of the American people, a patriotic force. There's still a lot to understand. People become seasoned in war, they become challenged, they become tested. People like it to be a quick victory. That was true in the American Revolution. People thought everything's going to be peachy keen and easy over, like a fried egg after Boston, and all of a sudden there's a series of 3 major losses in New York, and it was really Washington's genius in crossing the Delaware that Christmas that really began to reclaim an offensive, but a sense that this was going to be a real war. We are in a real war for the country, but at least now we're finally fighting. They've been waging it on us for decades. And people kind of said, no, they're not. They're not really waging war. And it's like, no, they are. So what we want to get at tonight is I want to situate some major political developments, because this is in some ways a discussion of the immediate political environment. But it's also a discussion of that main approach that we take, that what an army has to have, at least within its officers, the people who have self-selected themselves to lead, the Nathaniel Greens and the Putnams and the Knoxes and the Alexander Hamiltons, guys that volunteered to lead a war, a patriotic fight to establish a new nation, have to have a sense of what we're going to establish. And Hamilton knew that. Lincoln himself knew that we have to reestablish it under new circumstances, at more advanced levels. We today have to reestablish that constitutional system and that economic program. And we have to eliminate We have to annihilate the enemy to the point where they're forced to come to the surrender table. And at this point, the terms are unequivocal. Their system has to be eradicated. And in some sense, it has to become part of our constitutional law. What, in a sense, culturally, but perhaps even formally with amendments, we are going to abide by this American system. We're not going to tolerate this British liberal speculative program. Because when we give them that opportunity, that's when the drugs, the wars, the money printing, the central banking, all of that comes into play. Because we didn't remain committed to that program of investing into the American people and their productive and creative powers. So some things have developed over the last week. The situation in Ukraine, as many know, has become basically a love affair for swamp creatures like McConnell, McCarthy, but surprisingly, 57 Republicans. The last vote was much less. The first vote, I think it was only Thomas Massie who voted against the Ukraine support bills when it was 13 billion or whatever. Now it was 40. Joe Biden asked for 33, but Marjorie Taylor Greene came out and spoke eloquently to the fact that this is an absurd abuse of the American people, while you have the baby formula crisis, you've got an economic breakdown, massive drug addiction, you've got wars happening all over the world. All of a sudden, though, this is the private interest. And she was specific. This is a money laundering program. This is money laundering for the CIA, for defense contractors. It is a corrupt operation from Hunter Biden, the Biden family, that whole British kind of wing of American politics, and including the Brits. The Brits are stoking the fire on every single level. Much like we saw with the Iraq War and the dodgy dossier, the Brits are directly involved in creating the kind of intelligence lies. You know, the line that Putin and the Russians have run into all these roadblocks, that Putin is pissed, he's firing all these intelligence chiefs, he's irate, there's total chaos politically in Russia. All of it is false British intelligence. You can identify the source. It comes out of these kind of British cutouts that foment a kind of lie. Why? To build up this idea that somehow the Ukrainians might win. Back them up. They're the underdogs, the patriotic fight of the Ukrainians. It's very possible that the entire nation is dissolved, broken up into pieces, some to Poland, some to Hungary, much of it to Russia, because the British program backed by Biden is to not allow any real negotiation with the Russians, to fight it, as many say, to the last Ukrainians. So this 40 billion is going there. That's what it's going to do. It's going to be a massive windfall for Bidenistas and others in the environment. The Russians have strong control over much of what's happening. It's important to reference, Ukraine had the third largest army in Europe. First is Russia, second is Turkey. The third would have been Ukraine. So this is not insignificant, this conflict. There's talk now of Sweden and Finland joining NATO, nations that remain neutral. Finland exclusively neutral. Specifically after World War II, signed a treaty with the Soviet Union. So perhaps that's the formal excuse. But they're attempting, the British tendency is to push these nations into blocks, to force them into a NATO agenda. Finland, if people don't know, has a huge border with Russia, of which would then be militarized under these kinds of circumstances. However, the president of Turkey, Erdogan, has said it's not happening. Now, will that hold or not? It may be just negotiations by Erdogan. But the reality is that this process is tense with the threat of war because of what you might call the Biden breakdown. They like to call it the Putin price hike. In reality, it's the Biden breakdown. This system is failing. There is no support from the populations of Europe or the American population for any of this stacking of NATO, growing of NATO, threats and postures towards Russia. There's no support for it. Maybe with the constant pressure from news agencies around Ukraine, as soon as that's off the media, but increasingly 90% of the American people, the number one issue is the inflation, is the economic crisis. Inflation being only really one factor. So that's where Ukraine's situation probably, or the war danger sits. Russia is in strong command of the battlefield. The fate of Ukraine looks like it's an absolute disaster, like any other nation that becomes a client of this imperial program. And Zelensky is just a tool that'll be a clown once again when this is all over. But the threat of war is there because of this breakdown. Now, many people got some sense of the breakdown with this baby formula dynamic. Now, they've just apparently announced the FDA has gotten involved, Abbott Labs here in Sturgis, Michigan, which is the largest producer of baby formula. Consider this, we only have 3 plants in the entire country that produce all of the baby formula, half of which is bought by the federal government for its women, infants, and children program. So the level of production, of centralization, instead of having decentralized production processes all over the country for redundancy, for safety, for cleanliness, for competition. The same is true with meat packing, with a lot of our food supply. This stuff has to be straightened out. The same is true with our hospital and healthcare systems. You've got these choke points, you've got centralization, you've got, what's the word I'm looking for? Where it just becomes concentrated into a few hands. And what that leaves us is it leaves us into a kind of monopoly or cartel-like dynamic where then they control the market. They control the decisions. There really isn't a competition. There really isn't a free market. But I guess they're going to reopen up that lab. It was detected there was some bacteria. Reports I've seen is that the bacteria that did kill 3 infants was never even linked to the bacteria found in the lab, and that the bacteria found in the lab was also not in the center of production. Now, that's not a great thing either way, and by no means should we be loose or tolerant of bacteria in one of 3 major baby formula plants. But it's not even clear what the full story is on this. But it was gross incompetence. And you could say it's intentional. It could just be the level of negligent neuroses governing this entire grouping of so-called credentialed bureaucrats. They have no ability to run anything. So by intention, they're incompetent. They shouldn't be there. They've got a gross overestimation of their own capabilities. But it's not as if they're necessarily trying to do this, or there are clearly some people who may be directing it and undermining it. But the neurotic incompetence is so high that maybe it's just that level of stupidity and malfeasance. But that only is one angle. Much like the angle on inflation, on gas prices, apparently they've stopped the leasing of land for oil and drilling. The mining and resources of our country are completely locked up. We've basically eliminated all mining, all processing of raw materials. There is some mining literally in this country today that because of all the regulations, so-called environmental, the mining is done here and then we send it to China to be processed to then be brought back. They have literally for the last 50, 60 years, going back to like 64, 63, they have shut down the industrial process of our country. That is the systemic breakdown. It is not merely the fact that over the last 6 years, the stock market had doubled in value. It's almost unimaginable to think, and this is how most people define the crisis, which is wrong, but it just to consider it as a small window. The stock market, when Donald Trump came into office, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which we call the stock market as a metric, was 17,900. In January of this year, it was 37,000. It had more than doubled. In 6 years, the equity on the stock market doubled, and our nation has been, Trump did some things. He opened up some production. But as a whole, there's no metric for this. It is a massive financial bubble. It is a massive, desperate panic. But the real crisis, but that's not the crisis. That's the crisis for them. It's a crisis for the bankers, for the hedge funds, for the private equity funds. And because it's very easy to pass legislation to say we can't have BlackRock or Vanguard buying up single family homes. You just make that illegal. You know, if a retired couple wants to own a couple rental homes, then fine. You know, investment homes, whatever. You're not going to have BlackRock and Vanguard and private equity buying up the single family home market. Just make it illegal. They're afraid of that process. But the deeper crisis we face is that our industrial productive process, from mining and extraction of raw materials to the processing, industrialization, to machining, and production of products and tools and machines necessary for our nation, the production of advanced equipment for energy plants, that has been shut down. We've got to get back to from the mine to the delivery, to the consumer or to the productive process itself in capital industries. We've got that full program, its entire process has to be re-engaged at an advanced and industrial level. This is what a national banking system refers to that commitment, to that capability. But what I wanted to do tonight is introduce something, because too often we categorize. And when we accept categories like economics, we've accepted the enemy's terrain. They've defined that in their liberal universities going back decades. Like the old saying was, before there was Hitler, there was Harvard. That's just the reality. These schools have been infamous for the destruction of real creative qualities for centuries in many cases. You know, John Quincy Adams, one of the most brilliant minds in American political and diplomatic and really even economic thought, really walked out of college thinking, you know, that wasn't really that sufficient. He abhorred becoming a lawyer, dropped out, and really was much more of a scientific mind, unlike his father. But that's just, the question is not accepting the academic categorization of ideas. Ideas in their very real nature are universal. They apply to human society. They apply towards the interface between human species and the physical universe in broad terms. They don't apply to a specific academic area where there can be commentary ad infinitum. And in some sense, when we reject that, to put it in the positive form, when we reject that categorization, we see that there are new subjects and topics that are accessible, that we can begin to discuss the universe that God created in ways of asking, how does that creation function? From the standpoint of a creation, not an incident, not a random circumstance, but as an intended creation that also provided us with the opportunity to act upon our own intentions. And that very much captures the nature, we might say the theological underpinnings of a national banking system. So that might seem a little bit broad, but let me share something. There we go. That's the one I wanted. Okay, so these are just three nestled spheres. You probably should ignore the box. That's a Euclidean box that small-minded people have imposed on high school kids for far too long. That box has little to do with the universe we're living in. But the spheres represent a device here. And they're in some ways part of the science of actual economy. And I'll tell you, but they're symbolic. So let me give some sense of what they're referencing in this case, why they're important. They're important visually to have a sense of kind of how we might think of these relationships. So the green outer sphere would be that which encompasses as a characteristic maybe I should even invert it. Yeah, maybe it's worth inverting it to make it more clear. Yeah, let's do that. Okay, so I'm going to change the way I think about it, because I think it'll be more clear. So let's start with the core elements that we start with investigating the physical universe. Well, in most cases, people start with the abiotic tendencies. And those abiotic tendencies are kind of reduced down to very simple mechanical, chemical relationships, electrostatic relationships from a physical science. But you just basically what I'm referencing is it's the sphere of activity of inert matter. Now, there was a great scientist named Bernard Riemann, and he says, the problem with that is that if you push it to the extremes, you might find something different. And Riemann was in the 1800s, prior to us really having the power to investigate that question of the extremes, the very, very large and the very, very, very small. But he had an inclination. And what we've come to realize now is that when you push out to the level of, say, galaxies, which are still what we would consider inert matter, abiotic, it's not a living organism or dominated by living organisms, then you still see some kind of structure. We've all seen the pictures of spiral galaxies. The Hubble telescope has given us a myriad range of views of that so-called abiotic universe. And there's remarkable structure and organization. There's even structure and organization to the clusters of galaxies. And so the same is true when you get to the very small. This is kind of beyond the scope of our discussion, and some of you may not be familiar with the references, but in quantum mechanics, there's a reference called entanglement, when two particles have a kind of an tied relationship to one another. And it's always been a bit of a paradox for scientists to resolve. But Einstein, again, kind of a student of Riemann's, recognized that there's a kind of characteristic that is potentially even self-organizing, and very, very cold temperatures, like minus 270 degrees Celsius, very cold or close to that. There's activity, what they call superfluidity, where all of a sudden the inert matter, the material, operates in highly organized, highly efficient ways that under other normal circumstances it wouldn't. And there's hypothesis that maybe even the quantum characteristic of entanglement is related to that phenomena. So Riemann had a certain suspicion. Now, why do I say that? Because in some ways, what we're looking at is a universe that, if you take it from a statistical standpoint, that it's all the same. Well, you take what's the normal encounters of chemical and regular, physical mechanics. Everything seems to be nice in a nice, neat little package. This is kind of how Newton said, oh, and the planets move based on what they call the inverse square law. The problem is that Newton had nothing to do with the discovery of the planets or their motions. And the man who did said and the man who did, Kepler, who had a sense of the inverse square law, had placed no great importance on it. He recognized there was something much more self-organizing about this process. So what I'm suggesting is that then the way we think about the physical universe, one should never be statistical, and that there's something indicated at the very largest levels and at the very smallest and perhaps coldest and hottest levels, where a process occurs that suggests something self-organizing. Now that's interesting. The reason that's really interesting is because if you go to the next sphere, so we'll consider that the blue sphere to be that sphere. If you go to the red sphere, what we find is that, and what we call it today, the biosphere, that there's almost like a shell of living activity. And where that shell of living activity is present and dominant, the self-organization is huge, and it is ever present everywhere. And you see it in broad characteristics. You see it in evolutionary tendencies, from small bacteria to larger and more complex organisms. You see it in the transformations of soils, right? We all know this. If you have your garden or your backyard, you'll watch things grow. You'll watch the soil size or the size of your yard expand and go up, because there's a constant processing of new organic material building up the process that basically creates the potential for more life, for more dense activity. And this, of course, is fed by the sun. There's photosynthetic qualities. And wherever this living process takes place, it is self-organizing, and it's far more effective. It's far more powerful. It's like a geological force on the planet that makes those abiotic events, even perhaps galaxies, certainly at the very cold temperatures, look like just small suggestions, small characteristics of the way the universe functions. But living dynamics say this is where we're going, and they're powerful. The problem is, as we know, when we look out into our solar system and even beyond now, where this living process is dominant perhaps is limited. It may only be on this planet in the entire universe. We have yet to define it otherwise, but we'll see. That's the fun part. The third sphere is what came to be known in the late 1800s, early 1900s, turn of the 20th century, and especially by a Russian scientist, Russian-Ukrainian actually, a guy named Vernadsky. And he recognized this biosphere in a way that was unique, that it was something over broad reaches of time that transformed every aspect. It transformed the materials. Like you think of the iron ore in the Great Lakes. These were from living processes. Much of the deposits of most minerals, gold, silver, copper, calcium, all of these deposits were really living processes shaping this dynamic. Coal deposits, we all know that, as a reference point. But Vernadsky recognized there was something different happening, and he in some ways located it in the United States. He actually called Abraham Lincoln one of the most powerful geological forces that had ever existed, partly because of his Continental Railroad. But what he recognized was that human activity was now becoming even more powerful than the self-organizing dynamic of living processes. So now in science, because of human advancement, we've been able to detect these self-organizing characteristics, whether up in the heavens and the galaxies, or even in quantum and very cold environments. But we were able to then begin, and what Vernadsky showed with the biosphere was that we had, to some extent, conquered enough of the natural forces that we were no longer victims of them. That we had made the discoveries in biology, in medicine, in industry, in food supply, that things where you'd have great famines or great scarcity or great diseases, we were beginning to solve them, so that we could look at nature not as something aggressive or antagonistic to human existence, but recognize that through the discovery of nature, we could master it and act upon it. And so from that standpoint, Vernadsky also then recognized there's a remarkable tendency that all of living processes participate in, from the smallest single-celled organism to the most complex herds or schools of fish or insects or other things, where they're highly organized, the bees and so on. Ants. But then he recognized there was something about the human species that in and of itself was even more geologically powerful than life. And that really is the question of, and this was demonstrated, right? We were demonstrating that we were taking these deposits of materials minerals, these concentrated deposits. We were now rapidly concentrating them even more into steel beams, into locomotives, into huge skyscrapers. We were now creating major densities of energy supply through coal, through oil, eventually through nuclear power, that we were creating this dynamic as a whole. And so he suggested that this is actually an even higher sphere, like the green one, of the noosphere. Noos referencing the quality of mind, going back to Greek classical thought in the Greek language. And that he said that we're entering into the age of the noosphere, that we've clearly demonstrated a grasp of the ability to self-organize. And Vernadsky was also insightful enough to identify, much like our founding fathers did, from a political standpoint, but Vernadsky from a scientific one in the sense of this underlying characteristic of the universe as a whole, that the ability for that process to occur happened within the mind of an individual. And this then gets us to that deepest question, right? Like I referenced before, the theology underlying a national bank. Because in some sense, what is truth? Truth is that aspect of the universe that we ascertain to be the underlying characteristic of where this creation is going, that it has directionality, that it is not just in an empty box freezing, going towards heat death as they try to scare the college students. This is the last picture I just wanted to show. This shows, in some sense, the three different trajectories, or you could say rates of self-organization. So the inner cone, the thin one here, what's called baseline, this is that self-organizing dynamic of the universe we live in at a basic abiotic level, that what scientists still define as some kind of statistical random quantum phenomena, but suggests in different ways, whether it's the anomaly of black holes, which they have no idea. There are major black holes at the very center of basically every galaxy. They're not just these kind of strange things. They seem to be organized aspects, or the quantum phenomena, or the galaxy structures in general. There's a characteristic unfolding. And it's partly why there's been such a block, perhaps, in why fundamental science is not advancing. Because when you impose an apocalyptic cult of the Big Bang, of climate change, these kinds of questions, you stunt the mind, you stunt the natural inclination of a mind, which is organized around this creative development. That the mind hypothesizes naturally that creative development. And when you begin to say that that creative development of the universe doesn't exist, well, how can you possibly advance in science and say physics? That's partly the problem we run into. But then the next cone shows the biosphere, that there's a higher rate of advancement, the self-organizing, where life occurs, the rate of advancement is far more powerful than the natural time frame, you might say. The time frame of non-living processes is much slower. When you get to the human species, we outpace this entire program. And it's that quality of rate of advancement and development that really took off, as I said, during the turn of the 20th century, or was clearly measurable. This is in the wake of Lincoln's Revolution, the revival of the American system, the Industrial Revolution, the entrepreneurship of the Edisons and Carnegies and Wright brothers and all of that, where you could identify that this phenomena was of a unique characteristic. And it's that which our enemy looks to destroy. And it is that quality, that characteristic of the human species, which is what the premise of a national banking system is, because we identify that rate of self-organization of the productive system, of the scientific and industrial and agricultural and organization of human society, of resources, of exploration, of going beyond even our Earth, that capacity is the intrinsic directionality of the universe and creation we live in. And yet, because we have a freedom, you might even say the very nature of free will is to identify and be able to identify and locate and then act upon that sense of directionality and to demonstrate it viable, right? It's not a theoretical academic thing. Demonstrate it to be true. Replicate that demonstration. Show how this can affect and benefit the characteristics of human life. That quality is why the national banking system is so critical, because it's willing to reflect that, versus the central banking reflects the egotistical destruction of that oligarchical community. They assert their will over God's. The national bank there is to support our unfolding discovery of that creative intention of the universe and to act upon it willfully and effectively. And that's really, to me, the underlying principle of what's at stake, because we're talking about a fundamental change in worldview. The Germans called it Weltanschauung. And that meant that it wasn't just the way you looked at the world, it was the underlying principle, that underlying characteristic, that personality, you might say, of the universe as a whole. And that's sometimes referenced as a Christian worldview in terms of the nature of man in that context. So this is really the nature of what we're discussing. This is the species difference, where we have an assertion of self-serving banking interests for a few, or the support of the discovery of the universe itself and how it functions, and to enable mankind to continue to explore it at more and more advanced platforms. Because what we've noticed is that there are platforms that leap upwards, like we saw in that 19th century United States economy, where all of a sudden spaceflight, telescopes, this is where we begin to find the galaxies in the early 20th century, because we've broadened our horizons through scientific and technological advancements. And it's that kind of platform of discovery that we want to continue and to continue to inspire. So those are my kind of opening remarks, a little bit more extensive, a little different. But to me, at the core of this discussion of how we set up a national bank is to know very much why we set one up. And then you have a better idea of the structure. So Keisha, I'll leave it there and see what people have for thoughts.